Welcome back, dear sleepers and history wanderers. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey that might seem at first glance rather dramatic for a sleep video. Viking gods, thunderhammers, world-ending serpents. But I promise you, and this is perhaps the beautiful irony of it all, that we're going to explore this fierce religious landscape in the most soothing way imaginable. Because here's the thing about studying Viking religion. It's absolutely fascinating in its bleakness. And there's something oddly comforting about contemplating a worldview where everyone, gods included, knew exactly how doomed they were. Think about that for a moment. The Vikings believed their gods would die. Not metaphorically. Actually die. At a scheduled apocalypse called Ragnarok, which everyone knew was coming. It's rather like believing in divine beings who've already read their own tragic ending and just carried on anyway. There's something almost admirably stubborn about it. So settle in. Adjust your pillows. Let the weight of your body sink into your bed. Tonight, you're not going to battle anything. You're simply going to drift through the cold northern landscapes of medieval Scandinavia, observing a people who lived under the watchful eyes of gods who were, frankly, not all that interested in saving anyone, not even themselves. And before we begin our journey, if you enjoy drifting off to the sound of historical narratives, do consider subscribing to Religious Stories for Sleep. Leave a comment telling us which religious tradition you'd like to explore next from the safety of your warm bed. And if you find yourself still awake at the end of this video, well, perhaps give it a like. Though honestly, if you make it to the end, we might need to try harder. Now then, let us begin with an ordinary day, or rather, what passed for ordinary when you lived in constant fear of offending beings who controlled the weather, the harvest, and your chances of dying gloriously versus dying embarrassingly. Imagine yourself waking before dawn in a longhouse somewhere in Norway, around the year 950. The first thing you notice, before you even open your eyes fully, is the cold. Not the kind of cold where you pull up an extra blanket, the kind of cold that has settled into the very bones of the wooden structure around you, that makes the air you breathe feel sharp in your lungs, that reminds you immediately and without mercy that comfort is not a right but a constant exhausting negotiation with the world. You're lying on a sleeping bench along the wall, covered in wool blankets and furs that smell of smoke and animal fat and human bodies. The longhouse is perhaps 60 feet long, home to your extended family and possibly a few thralls, slaves, whose presence you've learned not to question because questioning the social order would be almost as pointless as questioning the weather. The central hearth still glows faintly from last night's fire, but it's dying, and someone will need to coax it back to life. That someone, you realize with the particular resignation of routine, is probably you. But before you move, before you even shift beneath your coverings, you pause. And this pause, this moment of hesitation, is where we begin to understand the peculiar psychological landscape of Viking religious life. Because you're not just thinking about the cold, or the fire, or the work ahead. You're thinking about whether you dreamed, and if you did dream, what it might mean. The Norse people believed that dreams were not random firings of an exhausted mind, but visitations, messages, warnings. Dreams could tell you if a journey would end in death, if a business arrangement would sour, if the gods were pleased or, more commonly, irritated. And the problem, the magnificent anxiety-inducing problem, was that you couldn't simply ignore these messages. To dismiss a dream was to dismiss fate itself, that most immovable force in Norse cosmology, the concept they called Urlog. Fate, in the Viking understanding, was not something you could change. It simply was. Written, quite literally, according to their myths, by the three Norns, female beings who sat at the base of the world tree Yggdrasil and wove the threads of every life into an enormous, incomprehensible tapestry. Your birth was woven. Your death was woven. Everything between was woven. And yet, and here's where it becomes fascinatingly contradictory, you still had to act. You still had to make choices. You still had to try even though the outcome was already determined. Try to imagine living with that particular philosophical framework for a moment, not as an abstract concept, but as a daily reality. It's rather like being told you must take an exam where the grade has already been decided, but you still must sit the exam with complete sincerity, because not sitting it, that too is part of fate, but marks you as a coward. The Vikings didn't find this contradictory, or perhaps they did, and simply accepted the contradiction as one more harsh reality in a world full of them. So you lie there in the pre-dawn darkness, trying to remember if you dreamed, and whether the dreams bode well. Did you see ravens? Ravens could mean Odin was watching, never entirely a good thing, as Odin was notoriously unreliable and tended to favor people right up until the moment he needed them to die gloriously in battle. Did you see a ship? Ships could mean travel, trade, or drowning. Context was everything. Did you see a woman in white? That could be a desire, a guardian spirit of your family line, which was generally positive, unless she looked angry. Angry ancestors were a significant problem. Finally, you rise. The air is cold enough that you can see your breath in the dimness. Others are stirring now. The longhouse is never truly private, never fully quiet. Privacy, you've come to understand, is a privilege that your world simply doesn't accommodate. You live pressed, together, always within hearing of each other's conversations, arguments, coughs, snores, and other less mentionable sounds. The Vikings didn't really have a word for privacy as we understand it. The closest concept was about honor and shame, about what should and shouldn't be spoken of publicly, but the speaking happened within earshot either way. You dress in layers. A long undershirt of linen if you're fortunate enough to have linen, wool if not. Over that, a tunic that falls to your knees. Wool trousers wrapped with leg bindings. These bindings, long strips of wool or linen wound around your calves and secured, are both practical and slightly maddening. They keep your legs warm and your trousers in place, but they must be wrapped correctly or they'll come loose at the most inconvenient moments. You've become quite adept at this wrapping in the darkness. Shoes next. These are simple leather affairs, turned and sewn, worn soft from use. In winter, you might stuff them with dried grass for insulation, changing it daily when it becomes compressed and damp. Your feet, you've learned, are crucial. Bad feet can mean immobility, and immobility in a climate like this can mean death. Not the glorious death in battle that guarantees you a seat in Valhalla or Folkvanger, but the inglorious death of cold and hunger that leads to, well, no one is entirely sure where that leads. Hel's realm, perhaps? The goddess Hel, daughter of Loki, half living and half corpse, rules over those who die of sickness or age. Her hall is said to be cold and damp, which sounds remarkably like winter in Norway, suggesting that the afterlife might not be much of an improvement. This is the first truly grim realization of your day. You must constantly strive to die correctly. The manner of your death matters more than almost anything else in your life. Die in battle? Glorious. Die defending your honor? Noble. Die of disease? Unfortunate. Die in your sleep of old age? Well, one hopes you've lived honorably enough that someone remembers you fondly, because your afterlife prospects are, shall we say, limited. You move to the hearth and begin the careful process of rebuilding the fire. This is not simply a practical task. This is a sacred act, though you wouldn't put it quite that way. Fire is life. Fire is warmth. Fire is the opposite of the cold, dark, giants-inhabited wilderness that presses against your settlement from all sides. The fire must not go out. When Vikings traveled, they carried fire with them in special containers, because starting a new fire was difficult and time-consuming, requiring a fire striker flint and tinder that had to be absolutely dry. As you coax the embers back to flame, feeding them carefully with small twigs and then larger pieces of wood, you're participating in a ritual that connects you to the gods themselves. The gods, after all, gave fire to humans. Well, Loki did, technically, though that particular story is complicated and involves him being temporarily in trouble with the other gods, which was his natural state of being. Loki gave humans fire, and magic, and probably several other things that seemed helpful at the time, but would inevitably lead to complications later. That was Loki's way. The trickster, the shapeshifter, the one god who might actually survive Ragnarok, though only because he was clever enough to have positioned himself on both sides of every conflict. The fire catches properly now, and you can feel its warmth beginning to push back against the cold. Others in the household are rising, moving about their morning tasks. Someone is already at the quern, grinding grain for porridge. The sound is rhythmic, meditative, stone on stone, round and round. It's a sound you've heard every morning of your life, as familiar as your own heartbeat. But before breakfast, before the day truly begins, there are observances to make. You step outside into the sharp morning air. The sky is beginning to lighten in the east, a pale gray that promises or threatens another day. The farm spreads around you, the longhouse at the center, outbuildings for animals and storage, fields beyond that, and then forest. Always the forest, dark and deep and full of things that might be natural, or might be other. Near the house, there's a small structure, or perhaps just a post. Accounts vary, as these things were often quite simple, where offerings are made. Today, you've brought a small amount of bread, saved from yesterday's baking. You place it there carefully, murmuring words that are half prayer and half practical negotiation. You're not praying to anyone specific, really. That's not quite how it works. You're maintaining the relationship between your household and the various beings who might take interest in it. There are so many beings to consider. The land vetir, land spirits, who inhabit the fields and forests and must be treated with respect, or they'll ruin your crops and sicken your animals. The Alfar, elves, who are nothing like the gentle, beautiful creatures of later folklore, but are instead powerful, potentially dangerous beings who might bless or curse you depending on their mood and your behavior. Your own ancestors, the dead of your family line, who watch and judge and sometimes intervene. The gods themselves, distant and powerful and preoccupied with their own complex politics and their own inevitable doom. The offering of bread is small, but it's sincere, and sincerity matters. You're not trying to bribe the gods. They're far too powerful and far too proud to be bribed by a piece of bread. You're acknowledging them. You're saying, I remember you. I respect the order of things. I know my place in the web of obligations and relationships that holds the world together. because that's what Norse religion ultimately is, a vast web of relationships, obligations, and debts. You give offerings, and perhaps you receive favor, perhaps you don't, but you give them anyway, because not giving them is worse. As you turn back to the house, you notice something. A raven, perched on the roof of the longhouse, watching you with one bright eye. You freeze. Ravens are Odin's birds. Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, fly across the world each day bringing him information. Is this one of them? Probably not. There are many ravens in the world, most of them ordinary carrion birds. But you can never be certain. And uncertainty, in matters of religion, is the point. You can never be entirely sure whether something is a sign or simply a thing, whether the gods are watching or indifferent, whether your offerings have been accepted or ignored. The raven takes flight suddenly, its black wings stark against the pale morning sky, and disappears toward the forest. You release a breath you didn't know you were holding. Was that good or bad? Impossible to say. You'll mention it to the others at breakfast, and perhaps someone will have an interpretation, or perhaps everyone will simply file it away as one more ambiguous occurrence in a world full of them. Breakfast is porridge, made from barley or oats, thick and warm and flavored with whatever is available. Maybe some dried fruit if it's been a good year, maybe just salt if it hasn't. You eat from a wooden bowl with a wooden spoon, sitting on your bench by the wall. The conversation around you is the usual mix. Someone needs to repair the fence in the upper field before the sheep break through again. Someone else is worried about the supply of hay for winter. There's discussion of whether to make the journey to the market at the nearest trading settlement, and whether the weather will hold long enough. And then someone mentions the neighbor's child who died last week. Just mentions it, casually, in the way of people who live close to death and cannot afford to give it too much emotional weight, or they'd never stop grieving. The child was 3, maybe 4, took sick with a fever that wouldn't break. These things happen. The family made offerings, of course. Consulted the vulva, the seeress, who said the child's fate was woven and could not be changed. And so the child died, and was buried with a small toy and some food for the journey to wherever dead children go. No one at breakfast seems particularly moved by this recounting, not because they're cruel, but because childhood death is common enough to be almost routine. You yourself have siblings who died young, though you barely remember them. Most families lose several children. It's simply expected. The gods do not intervene to save children from fever. Why would they? The gods have their own problems. Odin is constantly trying to delay Ragnarok. Thor is fighting giants. Freya is managing the eternal tension between the Aesir and Vanir god families. They don't have time to concern themselves with every sick child in every farmstead in Scandinavia. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Norse religion for a modern mind to grasp. The gods are not particularly loving. They're not evil, exactly. They're just busy, preoccupied, focused on cosmic-level problems. They might help you if it serves their purposes. They might ignore you. They might actively work against you if you've somehow offended them, or if your suffering serves some larger plan you cannot begin to understand. There's no promise of salvation, no guarantee of justice, no assurance that good behavior will be rewarded or bad behavior punished, except insofar as your reputation among other humans is concerned. What the gods do offer is a certain kind of order. They keep the giants at bay, mostly. The giants Those primordial beings of chaos and destruction are constantly threatening to break through and unmake the world. The gods fight them back over and over in an endless battle that everyone knows will eventually be lost. But for now, today, the world continues to exist, and that's something. That's enough. You can plant your crops and raise your children and make your offerings, and the world will probably last at least until next winter. Probably. After breakfast, the real work begins. And this is where the religious dimensions of daily life become even more apparent, because nearly everything you do exists within a framework of ritual and taboo. Take farming, for instance. You don't just plow a field, you plow it in a specific way at a specific time with specific words or songs. You don't just plant seeds, you plant them with an awareness that you're participating in the great cycle of life and death and rebirth that the gods themselves are subject to. The seasons are not simply practical divisions of the year, but cosmic events with religious significance. Winter is a time of death and darkness, when the sun is weak and distant, when the world is as close as it ever gets to the chaos that preceded creation. Summer is a time of life and light, when the god's power is strong, when the ordered world reasserts itself. The transitions between these seasons, the spring planting and the autumn harvest, are liminal times, dangerous times, when the boundaries between the worlds are thin, and all manner of beings might cross over. Today, let's say you're working in the fields, tending to crops that might make the difference between surviving the next winter and not. The work is hard, repetitive, backbreaking. You're bent over for hours, pulling weeds, checking for pests, moving stones. Your back aches. Your hands are raw. And somewhere in the back of your mind, always, is the awareness that all of this effort might be for nothing. A late frost could kill everything. A dry summer could parch the fields. A wet autumn could rot the harvest. Raiders could come and burn everything you've worked for. Disease could sweep through the settlement. And there's nothing you can do about any of it except work and make offerings and hope that fate has woven a thread for you that includes survival. The uncertainty is constant. The vulnerability is absolute. You are, at all times, at the mercy of forces far beyond your control. Weather, disease, war, the will of the gods, the turning of fate itself. But here's the thing. The Vikings didn't seem to find this particularly depressing. Or rather, they found it depressing, but accepted it as simply the way things were. There's a certain strange freedom in accepting that you control almost nothing. It means you're not responsible for outcomes, only for effort. You plant the crops as well as you can, you make the offerings as sincerely as you can, and then you wait to see what fate has woven. If the harvest is good, you thank the gods and the land spirits. If the harvest fails, well, that too was fated, and you endure. Around midday, you pause for a simple meal, bread and cheese, perhaps some dried fish or meat, water or weak ale. The sun is higher now, providing some warmth, though the wind is still cold. In the distance, you can see other members of the community working their own fields, tending their own animals. It's easy to feel alone in this landscape, despite the presence of others. The world is so large, so indifferent, so full of forces that don't care whether you live or die. But you're not entirely alone, because woven through every aspect of your life are the stories, the myths, the poems and songs that everyone knows, that children learn from their earliest days, that are recited at feasts and gatherings, and during the long winter nights when there's nothing to do but huddle by the fire and try to pass the time until spring. These stories are not comforting, exactly. They're full of violence and betrayal and doomed struggles against impossible odds. But they provide a framework for understanding the world. They explain why things are the way they are, why there's conflict, why there's suffering, why even the gods cannot prevent the coming destruction of everything. And, perhaps most importantly, they provide models for how to behave in the face of all this bleakness. You're supposed to be brave, not because bravery will save you, it won't, but because bravery is honorable. You're supposed to be generous, not because the gods will reward you, but because generosity creates bonds between people. And those bonds might actually help when divine intervention won't. You're supposed to keep your word, not because there's a cosmic force enforcing truth, but because your reputation is the only thing that survives you, the only evidence that you existed, the only way you continue in the world after your death. And you're supposed to face your fate, whatever it is, with dignity, not resignation exactly, but acceptance. If you're fated to die young, then die young, but die well. If you're fated to live long, then live honorably. If you're fated to suffer, then suffer without complaint. The Stoics, centuries later in the Mediterranean world, would develop a similar philosophy. But the Vikings got there first, out of sheer practical necessity. When you live in a harsh environment with an unpredictable climate and believe in gods who can't or won't save you from an inevitable apocalypse, acceptance becomes not just a virtue but a survival strategy. The afternoon stretches on. The work continues, rhythmic and endless. At some point, dark clouds begin to gather on the horizon. Everyone notices. Everyone pauses to look. Weather is never just weather. It's a manifestation of the god's activity. Thunder is Thor fighting giants. Lightning is his hammer Mjolnir striking true. A storm could be simply natural meteorology, or it could be a sign of divine displeasure, or it could be both simultaneously. You hurry to finish your work before the rain begins. Others are doing the same, moving more quickly now, calling to each other. The animals need to be secured. Tools need to be put away. Everything that can't get wet needs to be brought inside. And all of this is done with a kind of practiced efficiency, born of repetition, because storms here are common and dangerous, and must be respected. The first drops of rain begin to fall as you make it back to the longhouse. Within minutes, it's a downpour, drumming on the roof, turning the ground outside to mud. Everyone crowds inside, dripping, shaking off water. The fire is built up. Wet clothes are changed for dry. And then, with nothing else to do, the community settles in to wait out the storm. This waiting is its own kind of ritual. Someone starts mending clothes. Someone else sharpens tools. Children play quiet games in the corner. And someone, usually an older person, someone who knows all the stories, begins to recite. Maybe it's a saga about the settlement's ancestors. Maybe it's a myth about the gods. Maybe it's a poem about a famous warrior, or a legendary voyage. Let's say today, it's the story of Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent. You've heard this story dozens of times, but you never tire of it. The way it's told, with rhythm and repetition, and careful pacing. Thor, the strongest of the gods, goes fishing with a giant named Hymir. Thor uses an ox head as bait. The serpent, Jormungandr, the world serpent that encircles the entire earth, biting its own tail, takes the bait. Thor pulls it up, actually pulls up this cosmic monster, and is about to strike it with his hammer when Hymir, terrified, cuts the fishing line. The serpent sinks back into the depths. The story ends there, unresolved. Thor didn't kill the serpent. The serpent didn't kill Thor. They'll meet again at Ragnarok, and then they'll kill each other. Everyone knows this. The story doesn't try to hide it or make it more palatable. Thor will kill the serpent, but the serpent's venom will kill Thor immediately afterward. That's what's woven. That's what will happen when the final battle comes. And you sit there in the longhouse, listening to the rain on the roof, listening to the story you've heard 100 times before, and you think about what it means to be a god who knows exactly how and when he'll die, but continues fighting anyway. There's something almost comforting about it. If even Thor can't escape his fate, then your own inevitable death seems less personal, less frightening. You're all doomed together, you, your family, your community, the gods themselves, the entire world. Doomed, but not yet destroyed. Still here, still fighting, still working, still making offerings, still telling stories. The storm passes eventually. They always do. The evening comes on, cold and wet but calm. The household gathers for the evening meal. More porridge, some preserved meat, bread if any remains. The conversation is quieter now, tired. Someone mentions that tomorrow they'll need to check the damage from the storm. Someone else wonders if the ships will arrive from the trading settlement soon, bringing goods from abroad. Honey, spices, perhaps even some silver. Silver, in your world, is not just currency. It's a measure of worth, of status, of the gods' favor in a sense. Silver can be fashioned into arm rings, which are given by leaders to their followers as rewards for loyalty and service. Silver can be buried with the dead to provision them for the afterlife. Silver can be hoarded, displayed, used to build relationships and alliances. But silver can also be stolen, or lost, or demand, and the pursuit of it drives men to violence and betrayal. Even good things in this world carry danger. As night falls fully, the household settles in for sleep once more. The fire is banked but not extinguished, never fully extinguished, because restarting it would be too difficult. You return to your sleeping bench, pull the furs and blankets over yourself, feel the familiar cold pressing in from all sides despite the fire's warmth. And lying there in the darkness, surrounded by the breathing and shifting of your family, you think about the day that's passed, the work done, the offerings made, the signs observed, the stories told. You wonder, briefly, what the gods are doing right now. Are they in their halls in Asgard, feasting and planning and arguing? Is Odin wandering the world in disguise, gathering information for the battles to come? Is Thor somewhere smashing giants? Is Freya weeping her tears of gold for her missing husband? Is Loki plotting something that will seem like a good idea, but inevitably lead to catastrophe? Or are they not thinking of you at all? Not thinking of any of you, all you mortals struggling in the cold northern lands, making your offerings and telling your stories and hoping your crops will grow and your children will survive. Perhaps the gods are too busy with their own concerns to notice individual humans, except when those humans do something particularly heroic or stupid or both. And somehow, this thought doesn't make you feel abandoned. It makes you feel realistic. The gods are powerful, but they're not omnipotent. They're wise, but they're not omniscient. They're eternal, but they're not immortal. They'll die at Ragnarok just like everything else. They're not that different from you, really, just operating on a larger scale with higher stakes. They can't save you from fate any more than you can save yourself. But they maintain the order of the world for as long as possible. They keep the giants at bay. They give you a framework for understanding why everything is so hard and so uncertain. You wonder if you'll dream tonight. You wonder what the dream might mean if you do. You wonder if tomorrow will be the same as today. Work and worry and watching for signs. Or if something will change. Though what could change, really? You're woven into the tapestry of fate just as firmly as everyone else. Your thread is your thread. Where it leads, you'll follow, whether you want to or not. But you'll follow it bravely, you tell yourself. You'll follow it honorably. You'll follow it in a way that, if anyone tells stories about you after you're gone, they'll say you faced your fate with dignity. That's all anyone can do. That's all even the gods can do. Face the inevitable doom with courage and style. And with that thought, simultaneously bleak and oddly comforting, you drift toward sleep. The longhouse around you is dark, save for the dim glow of the banked fire. The cold presses close. Tomorrow will be another day of labor and uncertainty and offerings and stories. Another day of living under the eyes of gods who cannot save you from anything, least of all yourselves. Another day of being Norse, in all its complicated, contradictory, grimly determined glory. But that's for tomorrow. Tonight, you sleep, and hope you don't dream of ravens, now that we've wandered through the anxious daily existence of an ordinary Norse person. Let us turn our attention to someone who occupied a rather more complicated position in this world of omens and obligations. Let us consider the Godai, the religious leader, though that term doesn't quite capture the full scope of what such a person actually did. Calling someone a Godi is rather like calling a medieval king a man who wears a crown. Technically accurate, but missing several important details about political power, military command, legal authority, and the constant threat of assassination. The word Godai, incidentally, is related to the word for God, Gud, which should give you some sense of the status these individuals held, though it's worth noting that in typical Norse fashion, being related etymologically to the divine didn't actually guarantee divine protection, divine favor, or even divine interest. It simply meant you had responsibilities that went beyond the ordinary. And responsibilities in Norse society were always a double-edged sword. They brought prestige, certainly, but they also brought expectations. And failing to meet those expectations could result in anything from social ostracism to having your hall burned down around you while you slept. Imagine yourself, then, as a Godai in Iceland around the year 980. We're focusing on Iceland specifically, because the sources for Icelandic Godar, the plural of Godai, are somewhat better than for their counterparts in mainland Scandinavia, where Christian conversion came earlier, and rather more enthusiastically erased many of the old practices. Iceland, isolated and stubborn, held on to the old ways longer, and then had the good fortune, or the obsessive attention to detail, to write everything down after conversion, preserving a remarkable amount of information about how things used to be done. You are, let's say, a man of perhaps 40 years. You've survived childhood diseases, you've survived several feuds, you've survived at least one winter so bad that you seriously considered whether cannibalism might be necessary before spring finally arrived. It wasn't. But the fact that you considered it tells you something about the margins on which life operates here. You've inherited your position as Godai from your father, who inherited it from his father, though inheritance in these matters is never entirely straightforward. You've also had to demonstrate that you're worthy of the position, that you have the intelligence, the courage, the political acumen, and the sheer bloody-mindedness necessary to lead. Your responsibilities are multifaceted in a way that would seem bizarre to later, more specialized societies. You are simultaneously a priest, a chieftain, a judge, a military leader, and a politician. You maintain the temple, the Hof, though we'll discuss the mystery of what these temples actually looked like in the next segment. You perform sacrifices and rituals at appropriate times. You interpret omens and dreams. You adjudicate disputes among your followers. You lead them in battle if necessary. You form political alliances through marriages, fostering relationships, and elaborate gift exchanges. You host feasts where loyalty is rewarded and status is performed. And here's the thing that's rather fascinating. You're not really separate from ordinary society. You don't live apart in some monastery. You don't take vows of celibacy or poverty. You're not specially ordained by any divine authority. You're simply a prominent farmer who also happens to maintain the local temple and organize religious observances. You have a wife, children, servants, thralls. You own land, raise sheep and cattle, worry about the hay harvest just like everyone else. The sacred and the secular are not divided in your life. They're thoroughly intermixed, impossible to separate. Your day begins much like the day we described in the previous segment. Cold, dark, the reluctant rising from sleep. But your morning offerings are more elaborate, more formal. You don't just leave bread at a small shrine. You go to the temple building, if it's large enough to be a separate structure, or to the designated sacred space within your own hall. You make offerings on behalf of your entire Godord, the community of people who have sworn allegiance to you. This is a political unit as much as a religious one. People choose their Godai, at least in Iceland. They can change allegiance if they're dissatisfied with your leadership. So you're always, in a sense, performing, demonstrating your competence, your connection to the divine, your worthiness to lead. The offerings you make might include food, bread, meat, cheese. They might include drink, ale or mead poured out onto the earth or onto the altar. On special occasions, they'll include animals. This is where we need to discuss sacrifice, that most misunderstood aspect of Norse religion. The word in Old Norse is blot, and it's not quite the same as sacrifice in other religious traditions. It's not about appeasing angry gods or paying for sins. It's about maintaining relationships, honoring agreements, participating in the cycle of reciprocity that holds the cosmos together. When you sacrifice an animal, let's say a horse, which is particularly valued, the process is both practical and sacred. The animal is killed efficiently and with as little suffering as possible, because causing unnecessary suffering would be pointless and potentially offensive to the spirits. The blood is caught in a bowl and then sprinkled on the altar, on the walls of the temple, and on the people attending the ceremony. This is not meant to be gruesome. It's meant to be connecting. The blood is the life force, and by sharing it, everyone present becomes connected to the sacrifice, to each other, and to the gods who receive the offering. Then, and this is the part that's easy to miss if you're focused on the mystical aspects, the meat is cooked and eaten. The sacrifice becomes a feast. The community gathers and shares the meal, strengthening social bonds, redistributing wealth in the form of food, and enjoying a break from the usual diet of porridge and preserved fish. This is practical religion. The gods get the blood, the smoke, the honor. The people get the meat, the fellowship, and the reassurance that their leader is wealthy enough to sacrifice valuable livestock on their behalf. But let us return to your daily routine as a Gaudi. After the morning observances, you have practical matters to attend to. Several men from your Godord have come to you with a dispute. One man's sheep have wandered onto another man's land and eaten some of his hay. In winter, when hay means the difference between livestock surviving or starving, this is not a trivial matter. The owner of the sheep claims it was an accident, that his fences were adequate, that the other man's land boundaries are unclear. The owner of the hay claims negligence, demands compensation, and hints darkly that if satisfaction isn't given, more direct action might be necessary. You listen to both sides. You ask questions. You consider precedent, what was decided in similar cases before. You consider the relative status of both men, their families, their alliances. You consider how your decision will affect your own position, because if you're seen as unfair or biased, people will leave your Godord and swear allegiance to a rival Godi. Finally, you render a judgment. The sheep owner must compensate the hay owner with a certain amount of dried fish or silver, but the amount is less than what was demanded, because the hay owner's land boundaries are, in fact, somewhat unclear and should be properly marked before next summer. Neither man is entirely happy with this decision, which probably means it's fair. They accept it because rejecting it would mean rejecting your authority entirely, which would require them to find a new Godai or simply become outlaws, people outside the protection of law and society, who can be killed by anyone without consequence. This is the subtle violence underlying your position. You don't enforce your judgments with police or armies. There are no such things. You enforce them through the threat of social exclusion, through shame, through the implied possibility that if someone defies you repeatedly, they might wake up one morning to find their house surrounded by armed men who are there to discuss matters more forcefully. The morning passes with more such cases. A marriage agreement that needs to be negotiated. A young man who wants to join a trading expedition but whose father forbids it. They've come to you to mediate. A woman who claims her neighbor has been practicing cedar, magic, against her family, causing illness in her children. This last one is particularly delicate because cider is both real and dangerous in the Norse worldview, but accusations of it can also be weapons in feuds, ways to destroy someone's reputation or justify violence against them. You question the woman carefully. What makes her think cider is involved? Have there been unusual signs? What is the history between these families? The woman describes dreams, strange animal behavior, the particular way her children's illness came on suddenly and without obvious cause. You promise to look into it, which is a way of taking the accusation seriously without committing to any particular action. You might consult with a vulva, a seeress who specializes in such matters, or you might simply wait and see if the children recover, in which case the accusation becomes moot. Or you might quietly speak with the accused neighbor and suggest that whether or not they're actually practicing cider, it would be wise to make some conciliatory gesture toward the accusing family, perhaps a small gift or offer of help to ease tensions. This is the reality of your position. You're part judge, part therapist, part politician, part mediator, constantly managing relationships and tensions and competing claims. And always, underlying everything, is the awareness that your authority comes not from any institutional power, but from personal prestige, from your reputation, from the loyalty you can inspire and maintain. You are always, in a sense, performing confidence and competence. Any sign of weakness, any serious mistake in judgment, and your position becomes vulnerable. Around midday, you eat a better meal than most people in your community, because you're wealthy enough to afford it, and because demonstrating wealth is part of demonstrating status. Meat, perhaps. Good bread. Cheese. Ale. That's actually pleasant to drink rather than the weak, barely fermented stuff most people make do with. Your wife joins you, and this is worth pausing to consider, because the position of a Godey's wife is itself significant. She's not just a spouse. She's a partner in your enterprise. She manages the household, which in a large farmstead is equivalent to managing a small business. She oversees the servants and thralls. She organizes the textile production, the spinning and weaving that occupies much of women's labor, and produces cloth that's both practical and valuable as trade goods. She likely has her own religious responsibilities as well. There are certain rituals and practices that are specifically women's domain, particularly those involving cider magic and the honoring of female deities like Freya. The relationship between men's religion and women's religion in Norse society is complex and not entirely understood, because the sources were mostly written down by Christian men who had their own biases and blind spots. But it seems clear that while men like you perform the public sacrifices and lead the community rituals, women have access to forms of spiritual power that are both respected and slightly feared. A vulva, Osiris, can command enormous respect, and even Godar will defer to her pronouncements. At the same time, cider magic is considered somewhat unmanly for men to practice, which suggests it belongs to a different sphere of power, one associated with women, with fate weaving, with the mysterious forces that even the gods cannot fully control. Your wife might practice some forms of cider herself, though she'd be discreet about it. Or she might simply be skilled in the kinds of practical magic that shade imperceptibly into medicine and common sense. Herbs for healing, charms for protection, rituals for ensuring fertility in livestock and women alike. She's certainly skilled in managing people, which is its own form of power. And she's skilled in the elaborate social dance of hospitality, reputation, and alliance that defines aristocratic life in this world. After the meal, you might spend time with the accounts, such as they are. You don't have writing in the sense of literacy for keeping records. Runes exist, but they're used for specific purposes. Monuments, magical inscriptions, brief messages. They're not used for accounting or contracts or the mundane record-keeping that later societies will take for granted. Instead, you keep track of debts and obligations through memory, through witnesses, through the elaborate oral culture that stores information in human minds rather than on pages. You remember who owes you what, who you've helped and who therefore owes you support, who you've given gifts to and who therefore is obligated to reciprocate. The entire social structure operates on this web of remembered obligations, and your ability to remember accurately and to have others remember accurately is crucial to your power. This is why the skalds, the poets, are so important. They memorize and recite the genealogies, the deeds of ancestors, the terms of agreements. They are living libraries, walking archives, and they must be supported and honored because they literally preserve the social order in their minds. In the afternoon, you ride out to inspect your lands. You own several farms, which are worked by tenants and thralls. As a Godi, you need to be wealthy to maintain your position. You need resources to host feasts, to give gifts, to help your followers when they fall on hard times. Wealth is not just about personal comfort. It's about political survival. A poor Godi is a contradiction in terms. If you can't display generosity, if you can't fulfill the obligations of leadership, people will abandon you for a more prosperous leader. The ride takes you through the Icelandic landscape. Stark, beautiful, utterly unforgiving. Black volcanic rock, patches of green where grass manages to grow, distant mountains, the ever-present possibility of sudden weather changes. Iceland is a young land geologically, still actively volcanic, and this is known and acknowledged in your worldview. The land itself is alive, powerful, potentially dangerous. The earth can open up and swallow farms. Hot springs can suddenly appear or disappear. Avalanches can bury entire settlements in winter. This geological instability mirrors the social instability of Icelandic society. Everything is in flux. Alliances shift. Feuds erupt suddenly over seemingly minor insults. Violence is always just beneath the surface of civilized interaction, ready to break through when honor is challenged or ambitions clash. As a Godi, you're supposed to manage this violence, to channel it through legal proceedings and formal duels rather than letting it explode into uncontrolled bloodshed. But you're also expected to be capable of violence yourself, to lead your men in battle when necessary, to be personally brave and formidable. This is one of the more interesting contradictions of your position. You're a religious leader, but there's no expectation of pacifism, of turning the other cheek, of loving your enemies. Those are Christian concepts that haven't arrived yet. Well, they're starting to arrive, brought by missionaries who get a rather mixed reception. You've heard about this new religion, this Christ who preaches forgiveness and meekness. It sounds, frankly, like a good way to get yourself killed. The gods you serve don't. Preach meekness. Odin is a warrior and a schemer. Thor is a fighter who solves problems by hitting them with a hammer. Freya is associated with love and fertility, yes, but also with war and death. Even Balder, the closest thing Norse mythology has to a gentle, beloved figure, dies and stays dead, mourned but not resurrected. You reach one of your tenant farms and speak with the family there. They're doing adequately. The harvest was sufficient. The animals are healthy enough. They express their gratitude for your leadership, though whether this gratitude is genuine or performative is impossible to say. Probably both. They need you, your protection, your connections, your intervention if they face legal troubles. And you need them, their labor, their loyalty, their presence at rituals and assemblies. On the ride back, you pass the site where your father is buried, a mound carefully constructed, containing his body and his grave goods, weapons, jewelry, tools for the afterlife. You pause there, as you often do, and make a small offering. Remembering your ancestors is not sentimental in your worldview. It's practical. The dead remain part of the family, part of the social network. They can help or harm the living depending on how they're treated. Your father, in particular, you want to remain on good terms with. He was a powerful Godi, and his reputation still benefits you, but he was also known to be harsh when offended. Better to keep making offerings, keep speaking respectfully of him, keep maintaining his burial mound properly. Evening approaches, and with it comes the most important aspect of your role, hospitality. Tonight, you're hosting a feast. Not a major one. Those happen at specific times of year, during the great festivals, but a smaller gathering for your closest allies and most important followers. This is where much of the actual work of being a Godi happens, in the informal conversations over food and drink, in the strengthening of bonds, in the subtle negotiations and demonstrations of status. Your hall, larger than an ordinary farmhouse, but not absurdly so, is prepared. The long fire burns in the center, smoke rising to escape through the opening in the roof. The benches along the walls are cleaned. Tables are set up. Your wife has overseen the preparation of the feast, roasted meat, several kinds of bread, preserved vegetables, cheese, butter, and importantly, plenty of drink. Ale and mead flow freely at these gatherings. Hospitality requires generosity, and generous drinking is expected. The guests arrive as darkness falls. They're announced by your doorkeeper, their names and lineages recited, to remind everyone of connections and genealogies. Social memory again, performed and reinforced. Each guest is greeted personally, warmly, shown to their seat according to their status. The seating arrangement matters enormously. Sit someone too far from the place of honor, and you've insulted them. Seat enemies too close, together, and you're inviting violence. Manage the arrangement properly, and you've reinforced the social hierarchy in a way that everyone can see and understand. The feast begins. Food is served. Drink is poured. And the conversation starts carefully, feeling out the mood, the tensions, the opportunities. Someone mentions a recent legal case. Someone else brings up the weather, the prospects for next year's harvest. Gradually, the talk becomes more animated as the ale takes effect, more boisterous, more friendly, and more dangerous simultaneously. This is where you must be most careful. Drink is expected. Refusing to drink heartily would be seen as suspicious, possibly cowardly. But you must remain in control, must maintain your authority, must be ready to diffuse any situation that threatens to turn violent, because these feasts can turn violent quite suddenly. An old insult is remembered and brought up. A perceived slight in the seating arrangement festers. Two men who've been rivals over a woman or a piece of land drink enough to decide that now is the time to settle matters. Your role is to manage these tensions, to redirect the conversation if it's heading somewhere dangerous, to make a joke that breaks the building hostility, to remind everyone of their obligations to the peace of your hall, of the sacred duty of guest right that protects people under your roof. And, if violence does break out, despite your efforts, to stop it quickly and decisively, to separate the combatants, to impose your authority before someone gets killed and a blood feud erupts that could last generations. But tonight, let's say the feast goes well. The food is eaten, the drink flows, stories are told, and here, at last, is where your religious function and your social function become most obviously intertwined. You tell stories of the gods, myths that everyone knows, but that bear repeating because they're not just entertainment. They're instruction manuals for living. They're explanations of how the world works. They're examples of how to behave and how not to behave. You might tell the story of Odin sacrificing himself to himself, hanging on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights, wounded by his own spear, to gain knowledge of the runes. It's a strange, self-destructive story, but it teaches something important, that wisdom requires sacrifice, that knowledge has a cost, that even the gods must suffer to gain power. Your listeners nod along, recognizing the lesson, applying it to their own lives where hard choices must constantly be made. Or you might tell the story of Thor's journey to Utgard Loki's hall, where he and his companions are challenged to various contests and fail at all of them. only to discover later that they were competing against illusions. Thor couldn't drain the drinking horn because it was connected to the ocean, couldn't lift the cat because it was actually the Midgard serpent in disguise. It's a humorous story in its telling, but it's also unsettling. Even Thor, the strongest of the gods, can be tricked and humiliated. What chance do ordinary humans have? The lesson might be humility, or wariness, or perhaps simply that the world is stranger and more dangerous than it appears. As the evening progresses and the drink continues to flow, the mood becomes more contemplative. Someone begins to recite poetry, not the narrative sagas, but the more complex, alliterative verse that's the mark of true skill. The words are carefully chosen, the metaphors elaborate. A ship is a wave horse. A warrior is a feeder of ravens, meaning he kills enough enemies to provide carrion for Odin's birds. The poetry is a demonstration of culture, of education, of the verbal arts that this society values as highly as physical prowess. And then, someone, perhaps you yourself, begins to speak of more serious matters, of the threats facing the community, of rumors that a rival Godi is gathering support, possibly planning to challenge your authority, of news from Norway, where kings are consolidating power and forcing conversion to Christianity, and where some of your own people have connections and conflicts, of the eternal question of Iceland itself. Can this experiment in consensus governance work, or will it descend into chaos and require the imposition of a king? These are the conversations where real politics happen, where alliances are proposed and considered, where marriages are arranged to bind families together, where men commit to supporting each other in legal disputes or feuds. The feast is not separate from governance. It is governance, conducted over meat and mead, bound by the obligations of hospitality and friendship. Late into the night, the guests finally begin to leave or settle in to sleep in your hall. You're obligated to provide lodging as part of hospitality. The fire burns low. Your thralls clean up the remnants of the feast. You're exhausted, both from the physical demands of the day and from the constant mental effort of managing personalities and politics. But before sleep, you step outside once more into the cold night air. The stars are brilliant here, far from any competing light, and you know the patterns, the stories written in the constellations. There's the path that Odin's horse Sleipnir rides across the sky. There's the wagon of Thor. The stars themselves are said to be sparks from Muspelheim, the realm of fire, placed in the sky by the gods to light the world. You think about your position, about the strange hybrid role you occupy. You're not a priest in the way Christians use the term. You have no special divine calling, no supernatural authority. You're simply a man who maintains the rituals, who knows the traditions, who can intercede with the gods on behalf of your people. But that intercession is never guaranteed to work. The gods might listen, or they might not. They might help, or they might actively work against you, if it serves their larger purposes. And yet, you continue. You maintain the temples, perform the sacrifices, tell the stories, judge the disputes, lead the community. Why? Partly because it's expected, because it's your inherited role, partly because it brings status and wealth and a form of power, but perhaps also because even in a cosmos that promises ultimate doom, even in a world where the gods themselves will die, there's something meaningful about maintaining order, about performing the rituals, about keeping the giants at bay for one more day, one more season, one more year. The Christians talk about salvation, about a loving God who sacrifices himself to redeem humanity, about eternal life in paradise for believers. It sounds appealing, actually, in a way that makes you slightly uncomfortable to admit, but also suspicious, too easy, too good to be true. Your gods don't promise salvation. They promise only that they'll fight beside you until the end, and that the end, when it comes, will be glorious in its terrible finality. Everyone dies. Everything ends. But how you face that end, that matters. That's what your religion is ultimately about. You return inside, to the warmth of the fire and the sleeping forms of your household. Tomorrow will bring more disputes, more responsibilities, more careful navigation of the social and spiritual landscape you inhabit. More offerings to gods who may or may not be listening. More stories told to preserve the traditions and teach the values that hold your society together. More days of being a go-die, which is to say, more days of being simultaneously powerful and powerless, respected and vulnerable, connected to the divine, and ultimately subject to the same inexorable fate as everyone else. But that's for tomorrow. Tonight, finally, you sleep. And if you dream of Odin watching you from his high seat, judging whether you're worthy to join the Einherjar, the honored dead who will fight at Ragnarok, you try not to think about what it means that being worthy requires you to die violently in battle. Some thoughts are best saved for daylight, or better yet, not thought at all. And now we arrive at one of the more frustrating aspects of studying Norse religion, the places where it actually happened, or rather, the curious absence of clear evidence for where it happened. You'd think that a culture which practiced their religion for centuries, which made regular sacrifices and held elaborate ceremonies, would have left behind impressive temple complexes. Stone structures, massive altars, anything that archaeologists could point to and say, yes, here. This is definitely where Vikings worshipped their gods. Instead, what we have is complicated, ambiguous, fragmentary, rather like trying to reconstruct someone's entire life from finding 3 buttons, a broken comb, and a cryptic note that says, "Meet me at the place." You know something was there. Something significant happened, but the details remain maddeningly elusive. Let us begin with what the written sources tell us, and immediately we encounter our first problem. The sources were written down after conversion to Christianity, mostly by Christian monks or by people who had converted, and who therefore had both imperfect knowledge of the old practices and possible motivations to diminish or demonize them. Imagine asking someone to describe a religion they've deliberately abandoned, decades after the fact, in a language that doesn't quite have the vocabulary for the concepts involved. What you get is interesting, certainly, but not necessarily reliable. The Old Norse word for a temple is hof, and it appears frequently in the sagas and other texts. These hofs are described as buildings, sometimes quite large buildings, where sacrifices were performed, where idols of the gods stood, where communities gathered for religious ceremonies. Some descriptions are tantalizingly specific. The Eyrbyggja saga, for instance, describes a temple building that was 60 feet long, with a separate section at one end that housed images of the gods, and with an altar in front of these images where sacrifices were made. The text describes a great ring kept on the altar, stained with sacrificial blood, upon which oaths were sworn. It describes how the temple could only be entered through a specific door, how there were designated sacred spaces within it, how the walls were hung with shields and weapons. It sounds impressive. It sounds like exactly the sort of archaeological evidence that should have survived in some form. And yet, when archaeologists go looking for these temples, they find not quite what they expected. Oh, they find buildings, certainly. They find evidence of ritual activity. But the grand temple complexes described in the sagas, those remain elusive. Which brings us to several possible explanations, none of them entirely satisfactory, all of them probably containing some element of truth. First possibility. The saga descriptions are exaggerated or simply invented. The sagas were written as literature as much as history, and literature has never been opposed to embellishing details for dramatic effect. It's possible that the temple at Hof in Iceland or the great temple at Uppsala in Sweden were nowhere near as impressive as described, and that Christian writers either misremembered or deliberately inflated their descriptions to make the subsequent conversion seem more significant. We tore down their mighty temples sounds better than we convinced them to stop using that corner of the farmhouse for sacrifices. Second possibility. Norse temples were made primarily of wood, and wood, in the acidic soils of Scandinavia, deteriorates remarkably quickly. A massive wooden structure, even one that stood for centuries, might leave behind only the faintest traces, post holes perhaps, or soil discolorations where organic material once stood. Archaeologists have indeed found such traces, but interpreting them is challenging. Are these post holes from a temple, a large hall, a barn? Without clear evidence, special deposits, distinctive architecture accompanying artifacts that are unambiguously religious, it's often impossible to say. Third possibility, and perhaps the most intriguing. Norse religious practice didn't require the kind of permanent, specialized temple buildings that we associate with other religions. Perhaps the Hof was simply the main hall of a prominent family, used for feasting and daily life most of the time, and for religious ceremonies when needed. The sacred and the secular were not separated in Norse culture, as we've discussed. Why would their architecture separate them? This last possibility is supported by some of the archaeological evidence. At places like Upokra in Sweden and Tissø in Denmark, archaeologists have found large hall buildings with clear evidence of ritual activity, deposits of animal bones from sacrifices, concentrations of valuable objects, signs that these places were special. But they're not separate temple complexes. They're elite residences that also served religious functions. The Godis Hall, in other words, was the temple. The feast hall, where political alliances were made, was also the place where sacrifices were offered to the gods. There's something rather beautifully practical about this. Why build a separate structure that's only used occasionally when you can simply designate part of your existing hall as sacred space? The gods, in the Norse worldview, were not so precious that they required isolation from daily life. They were part of the fabric of existence, woven into every aspect of the world. Having their images stand in the same hall where you ate and drank and conducted business, that wasn't irreverent. That was appropriate. But let us imagine ourselves at one of these places. Let us try to reconstruct what a Hof might have been like, drawing on the fragmentary evidence we have and acknowledging that we're working with educated guesses rather than certainties. We'll visit the famous temple at Uppsala in Sweden, because even though the archaeological evidence is frustratingly limited, the written descriptions are vivid enough to give us something to work with. Uppsala, in the pre-Christian period, was a major religious and political center. The site sits on a rise overlooking the surrounding farmland, strategically positioned and symbolically elevated. According to Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler writing in the 11th century, there stood here a great golden temple, and near it a massive tree whose species no one could identify, whose branches were always green, and near which was a sacred spring where human sacrifices were performed. Human sacrifices. We need to address this, because it's one of the most controversial and most poorly understood aspects of Norse religion. Did the Vikings practice human sacrifice? The answer appears to be yes, but rarely, and under specific circumstances. The written sources mention it. Archaeological evidence provides some support. Bodies buried in unusual ways, with signs of ritual killing, found in contexts that suggest sacrifice rather than execution or murder. But the scale and frequency are unclear. Adam of Bremen claims that at Uppsala, 9 males of every living creature were sacrificed every 9 years, hung from trees in a sacred grove, and that the festival lasted 9 days. This sounds suspiciously neat. 9 is a sacred number in Norse tradition. Odin hung on Yggdrasil for 9 nights. There are 9 worlds in the cosmology. So Adam's description fits the symbolic system perhaps too perfectly, which makes some scholars suspicious that he's reporting myth or propaganda rather than actual practice. What we can say with more confidence is that animal sacrifice was common, and that the archaeological evidence for this is clear. Enormous deposits of animal bones at likely ritual sites, cattle, horses, pigs, sheep, all the domesticated animals that were valuable and that therefore made appropriate offerings. The bones show signs of careful butchering, of the meat being removed and presumably consumed, which fits with what we know about sacrifice, as both a religious act and a social feast. But back to the temple itself. Imagine approaching Uppsala as a pilgrim, or as someone attending one of the great seasonal festivals. You've traveled for days, perhaps weeks, to get here. You're in the company of hundreds of others, all converging on this sacred site. The journey itself is part of the ritual. You're leaving behind the ordinary world, entering sacred time and sacred space. As you approach, you see the complex of buildings. The temple itself, whatever its exact form, is clearly special, larger than an ordinary hall, perhaps decorated more elaborately. The sources mention gold, and, while this might be exaggerated, it's reasonable to think that wealth would be displayed here, gold leaf on wood, perhaps, or golden artifacts hung as offerings. The Vikings were not opposed to showing off, and a temple was an excellent place to demonstrate both piety and prosperity. Near the temple, the sacred tree. Whether there actually was a tree that stayed green year-round, or whether this is symbolic language for something else, we can't know. But sacred trees were definitely part of Norse religion. The world tree, Yggdrasil, was the central organizing symbol of the cosmos, and specific trees in the landscape were recognized as dwelling places of spirits or as markers of sacred space. To harm such a tree was to invite supernatural retribution. And the grove where sacrifices took place. This is where the practical and the sacred intersect in ways that are both fascinating and slightly disturbing. The sources describe bodies, human and animal, hanging from trees, decomposing, creating a smell that must have been overwhelming. This sounds horrific to us, but in the Norse context it might have been understood differently. The boundary between life and death was permeable in their worldview. The dead remained present, influential, dangerous if not properly managed. A grove full of sacrifice victims wasn't a charnel house. It was a liminal space, a threshold between worlds, a place where the boundaries were thin, and communication with the gods was possible. though one imagines the smell still would have been quite unpleasant, regardless of the symbolic significance. The actual ceremony of sacrifice, when it occurred, would have been a complex, multi-day affair. This wasn't a quick ritual performed by a single priest. This was a community event, requiring preparation, coordination, and the participation of many people. Animals would be brought, probably already selected days or weeks in advance. Animals without blemish, healthy, and valuable. The fact that you're sacrificing something valuable is crucial. An offering costs nothing if it costs nothing, if you understand the paradox. The Godi or other religious leader would oversee the proceedings, but many hands would be involved in the actual work. Animals must be restrained, killed, butchered, prepared. The blood must be caught and used in the sprinkling ritual. The meat must be cooked. Tables must be set. Drink must be poured. All of this while maintaining the appropriate reverent atmosphere. The sense that what's happening is not just a community barbecue but a sacred exchange with forces that transcend the human. Inside the temple, or inside the designated sacred section of the hall, there would have been images of the gods. What these looked like is, again, frustratingly unclear. The written sources mention them. Archaeological finds include small metal figures that might be gods: Thor with his hammer, Odin with his ravens, Freyr with his impressive fertility symbolism. But large cult statues. Direct evidence is scarce. Perhaps they were wooden and have long since rotted away. Perhaps they were simpler than we imagine. Carved posts, abstract representations rather than realistic statues. Or perhaps the saga descriptions of elaborate god images are accurate, and we simply haven't found them yet, because they were destroyed during conversion, or recycled, or buried in places we haven't looked. What we do know is that offerings were left for these images. Food, drink, valuable objects. The sagas describe ale being poured for the gods, toasts being made to Odin for victory, to Thor for good weather, to Freyr for peace and prosperity. These weren't just symbolic gestures. The gods were understood to be actually present in some sense, to actually receive and consume the offerings. How literally this was understood probably varied from person to person, just as the literal presence of Christ in the Eucharist is understood differently by different Christians. But the offerings were real, the reverence was sincere, and the expectation of reciprocity was genuine. Let us consider, for a moment, the psychology of worshiping in such a place. You've made a long journey. You've contributed an animal or other valuable goods for the sacrifice. You're surrounded by your community, by hundreds of people all participating in the same ritual. The air is thick with smoke from cooking fires, with the smell of roasting meat, with the sharp tang of blood. There's chanting or singing. The sources mention this but don't preserve the actual words or melodies, which is one of the great losses of religious conversion. There's the sound of many people moving, talking, the noise of animals, the crackle of fire. You're tired from travel and from the overwhelming sensory experience. You might have been fasting or otherwise preparing yourself spiritually. You might have drunk ale or mead, which the Norse used as both a social lubricant and a ritual substance. In this state, exhausted, overstimulated, slightly intoxicated, surrounded by community and symbol and expectation, the presence of the gods might feel very real indeed. This is not to dismiss the experience as simply psychological. The Norse would not have made that distinction. The gods were real, and they could be encountered through properly performed ritual. Whether that encounter happened in the external world or in the internal world of consciousness, was perhaps not a meaningful question. The point was that it happened, that the relationship was maintained, that the cosmic order was reinforced. But now we must address the great question that hangs over all of this. Why is the archaeological evidence so limited? If Uppsala was as important as the sources suggest, if sacrifices were performed there for centuries, if it was a major religious center for all of Sweden, why haven't excavations found more definitive evidence? Part of the answer is that Uppsala has been continuously occupied and modified for over 1,000 years. The Christian church built on or near the pagan site. This was common practice, a way of both co-opting and suppressing the old sacred geography. Medieval and modern construction has disturbed the earlier layers. The soil is acidic, as we've mentioned, which destroys organic material. And, perhaps most significantly, Christian conversion in Sweden was motivated partly by a desire to erase the physical evidence of paganism. Temples were torn down. Sacred groves were cut. Idols were destroyed or hidden. There's a rather poignant account from the conversion period of Iceland about a man who, forced to convert to Christianity, threw his images of the gods into a waterfall so that they wouldn't be destroyed by Christians, but also wouldn't remain accessible for worship. This waterfall, Godafoss, the waterfall of the gods, can still be visited. Whether images of Thor and Odin actually rest at its bottom, preserved by cold water and silt, or whether this is just a good story, we'll probably never know. But it illustrates the deliberate disappearance of cult objects during conversion. And yet, despite all these limitations, archaeology continues to discover new evidence. At Gamla Uppsala, the site of the famous temple, excavations have found traces of large buildings, though their exact purpose remains debated. Beneath the medieval church, there are signs of earlier structures. In the surrounding area, hundreds of burial mounds, some quite large and elaborate, speak to the site's importance. The presence of significant wealth in these burials, the careful orientation of the graves, the inclusion of ritual objects, all of this supports the idea that this was indeed a major religious center. More recently, in 2020, archaeologists announced the discovery of what might be a temple at Os in Norway, a building with traces of ritual activity, with a distinctive architecture that doesn't fit patterns for domestic or agricultural buildings dating to the right period. The evidence is still being analyzed, and the interpretation is still being debated. But it's the sort of find that reminds us how much we still don't know, how much evidence might still be hidden beneath farms and forests in modern towns. Other sites tell similar stories. At Borg in Lofoten, Norway, a massive Viking Age hall, reconstructed now as a museum, shows clear evidence of ritual use alongside its function as a chieftain's residence. At Lunda in Sweden, a small building near a larger hall has been interpreted as a possible hof based on its distinctive features and the deposits found around it. At Järrestad in Skåne, another possible temple site, though again the evidence is ambiguous and contested. What emerges from all this fragmentary evidence is not a single temple type, but a variety of sacred spaces. Some might have been separate buildings, others were sections of existing halls. Some were natural features, groves, springs, mountains, that were recognized as sacred without any human construction. The Norse religious landscape was perhaps more varied and more flexible than later, more institutionalized religions would be. And perhaps this makes sense for a religion without centralized authority, without a fixed dogma, without a clerical hierarchy enforcing uniformity. Each community, each region, perhaps even each family, might have had slightly different practices, different sacred spaces, different ways of honoring the gods. What mattered was not following a standardized ritual, but maintaining the relationships, honoring the obligations, participating in the cosmic web of reciprocity that held the worlds together. There's something rather beautiful about this, actually. The absence of grand temple complexes might not be a failure or a loss, but a reflection of a different way of thinking about the sacred. The gods didn't need stone monuments. They needed honor, remembrance, sacrifice, story. They needed humans to maintain the rituals, even though everyone knew the rituals ultimately wouldn't prevent Ragnarok. They needed the daily offerings at small shrines, the great seasonal festivals, the stories told at feasts, the names invoked in battle and in childbirth and at all the crucial moments of life. The temple, in the end, might have been less important than the community that gathered there. The building was just wood and nails and perhaps some decorative flourishes. What mattered was the people who came together, who sacrificed together, who ate together, who strengthened their bonds to each other and to the gods. The sacred space wasn't primarily physical. It was social, relational, enacted through ritual and maintained through participation, which brings us to a slightly melancholy realization. When conversion came, when the communities stopped gathering, when the rituals were abandoned and the stories were reinterpreted as mere literature rather than sacred truth, the temples could disappear almost without trace, because they had never been the point. The point had been the living religion, the active practice, the ongoing relationships. And when those ended, the buildings, whether grand or humble, became just buildings, ready to be torn down or repurposed or left to rot. What remains are questions without definitive answers, traces without clear interpretation. The frustrating awareness that we're looking at the past through a fog of time and cultural difference and deliberate erasure. We have the sagas, written down after conversion, filtering the old religion through Christian perspectives. We have archaeology, finding evidence that's tantalizing but ambiguous. We have comparative religion, looking at similar practices in other cultures and making informed guesses about what the Norse might have done. But we can never have, the living experience of entering a Hof at Uppsala, or Hof or Gamla Uppsala, when it was still active, still sacred, still full of the presence of gods and community, and the smoke of sacrifice. We can't smell what it smelled like, hear what the chants sounded like, feel what it felt like to be part of that world. All we can do is piece together fragments and acknowledge the gaps in our knowledge. And perhaps, as you drift toward sleep, there's something oddly appropriate about this uncertainty. The Norse gods themselves were not all-knowing. The universe was not completely ordered or completely understood. Mystery was built into the cosmology. Even the gods had limited knowledge. Consulted seers tried to learn the future but couldn't change it. Perhaps the mystery of the temples, the unanswered questions, the ambiguous evidence, is fitting for a religion that never claimed to have all the answers, that acknowledged the fundamental uncertainty of existence, that told stories about gods who would one day die along with everything else. The temples are gone, or mostly gone, or perhaps never existed in the forms described. But the stories remain, the gods remain in literature and art and modern imagination. The values, encoded in the myths, courage, honor, loyalty, acceptance of fate, continue to resonate. The physical structures were always temporary, bound to the same cycle of creation and destruction as everything else in the Norse cosmos. What matters, what persists, is the attempt to connect with something larger than oneself, to maintain relationships with the divine and with community, to face the chaos and uncertainty of existence with ritual and story and shared meaning. Whether that happened in grand gold-adorned temples or in simple wooden halls or in sacred groves under the stars, perhaps that's less important than the fact that it happened at all. And with that thought, we leave the mystery of the temples behind, accepting that some questions will remain unanswered, some evidence will remain ambiguous, and that this is simply the nature of studying the distant past. The fog of time never completely lifts. We see shapes, shadows, suggestions of what once was, and we do our best to understand, knowing our understanding will always be incomplete. Rather like the Norse understanding of the cosmos itself, really, vast, complex, ultimately unknowable in its entirety, but worth engaging with anyway, because what else is there to do? The temples are gone, the gods remain. Or perhaps it's the other way around, or perhaps both are true simultaneously, depending on what you mean by gone and what you mean by remain. But these are philosophical questions better left for waking hours, or perhaps not addressed at all. Let us move on. And now we turn our attention upward, as it were. We've explored the anxious daily existence of ordinary Norse people, navigated the complex role of the Godi, and puzzled over the mysterious absence of grand temples. Now, let us examine the apex of Norse society, the Jarls, the warrior nobility, the elite families whose wealth and power shaped entire regions, and whose approach to religion was inseparable from their approach to politics, warfare, and social prestige. If you've been drifting comfortably through the previous segments, you might want to adjust your position slightly now, because we're about to enter the world of Viking Age aristocracy, and it's a world of such elaborate social performance, such careful calibration of honor and obligation, such constant maneuvering for advantage, that even describing it requires a certain alertness. Though, of course, if you do fall asleep during this segment, you'll be in good company. Many a Viking Age feast-goer probably dozed off during the later hours, lulled by mead and the droning of a particularly lengthy genealogical recitation. Let us imagine ourselves at a great feast in the hall of a powerful jarl, an earl in the English cognate, somewhere in Norway around the year 920. You are a guest here, not quite of the highest rank, but important enough to be invited, positioned respectably, though not prominently in the seating arrangement. The hall itself is impressive in a way that the Godi's hall we visited earlier was not. This is a structure designed to overawe, to demonstrate wealth and power, to function as both residence and political theater. The building might be 100 feet long or more, its walls made of massive timbers, its roof supported by elaborately carved posts. These carvings are not mere decoration. They tell stories, depict gods and heroes and legendary beasts, serve as both art and religious symbolism. The entrance is through large wooden doors, heavy enough to require real effort to open, a not-so-subtle message about the threshold you're crossing. Inside, the central hearth is enormous, the fire a necessity for heat, but also a symbol of the Jarl's ability to keep such a fire burning, to afford the vast quantities of wood required. The walls are hung with tapestries, woven textiles that represent months of labor by skilled women, that display patterns and images in colors achieved through expensive dyes. Some tapestries depict scenes from mythology: Thor battling giants, Odin riding Sleipnir, the Norns weaving fate. Others show more recent history: battles won, ships sailed, treasures acquired. These are not just decoration. They are statements of identity, lineage, and legitimacy. They say, "This family has been powerful for generations. We have participated in great deeds. We are connected to the gods themselves through our ancestors and our actions." Weapons line the walls as well: swords, axes, spears, shields. Some are practical, meant to be seized in the event of sudden attack, because violence can erupt even in the most carefully managed feast. But others are display pieces, too ornate or too valuable to risk in actual combat. Swords with silver inlaid hilts, blades with pattern welding so complex that they seem to shimmer with their own inner light. These weapons have names: leg biter, bloodletter, skull splitter, and histories. Each has killed men, or is said to have killed men, or is descended from blades that killed men. The line between truth and legend blurs here, and no one particularly minds the blurring. A sword with a good story is worth more than a sword without one. The Jarl himself sits in the high seat, a position of honor, literally elevated above the others, positioned so that he can observe everyone in the hall. He is perhaps 50 years old, grizzled and scarred from decades of warfare and raiding. His beard is long, graying, braided with silver wire that catches the firelight. He wears a cloak fastened with an enormous brooch, gold, set with garnets, probably looted from a monastery in England or France during his younger years. His arm rings, bands of twisted gold and silver worn on the upper arms, proclaim his wealth and generosity. These rings are not just jewelry. They are currency, reward, and symbol all at once. A Jarl gives rings to his followers as payment for their loyalty and service, literally arming them with wealth. Next to him sits his wife, and we should pause here to consider her position, because the wife of a Jarl is not simply a consort or a decorative presence. She is a major power in her own right, managing the vast household, controlling access to the Jarl through her position as hostess, wielding influence through her own network of relationships and obligations. She wears her own wealth, brooches, necklaces, rings, but also keys. Large, elaborate keys worn at her belt, symbols of her authority over the household's locked storerooms. In a society where wealth is stored in the form of silver, grain, cloth, and other portable goods, the person who controls the keys controls significant economic power. She is responsible for the feast we're about to describe, not in the sense that she's cooked it herself, obviously, but in the sense that she has organized it, allocated resources, supervised the thralls and servants who've done the actual work, and, most importantly, designed the social choreography of the evening: who sits where, who is served first, whose presence is acknowledged prominently, and whose is treated as routine. These decisions are political acts, carefully calculated to maintain alliances, signal favor or disfavor, and demonstrate the family's social acumen. The feast begins with ritual. The Jarl stands, everyone else is already standing, waiting, and pours ale or mead from a great drinking horn into a bowl on the altar, or sacred space within the hall. He invokes the gods, probably Odin and Thor most prominently for a warrior aristocrat, but perhaps also Freyr for prosperity, and Njörður for successful sea voyages. The invocation is formal, practiced, hitting all the traditional phrases while also allowing for some personal variation. This is religion as statecraft, the Jarl demonstrating his piety, his connection to divine powers, his role as mediator between his people and the gods. Then comes the blot, the sacrifice that sanctifies the feast. An animal, probably a horse or a pig, has already been slaughtered in the appropriate ritual manner earlier in the day. Its blood was caught and sprinkled on the altar, on the walls, on the people attending the ceremony. Now the meat has been cooked and is brought into the hall in enormous quantities. The best portions are offered first to the gods, left on the altar or burned in the fire, and then distributed to the assembled guests in carefully calculated order. The Jarl receives his portion first, naturally, then his wife and family, then the most honored guests, perhaps a visiting king or powerful Godi, perhaps renowned warriors in the Jarl's service, perhaps wealthy merchants or skilled craftsmen whose presence and support are valuable. Then the rest of the guests in descending order of status. Everyone is watching this distribution. Everyone knows where they rank. Any deviation from the expected order is noticed and interpreted. Give someone a better portion than their status warrants and you signal favor, possibly the beginning of a new alliance. Give someone less than expected, and you've delivered an insult that might require a formal response. This is exhausting to even think about, isn't it? The constant awareness of hierarchy, the endless calibration of respect and insult, the way that even something as simple as serving dinner becomes a complex political negotiation. And yet, for the people in this hall, this is simply how life works. Status is everything. Honor is everything. Your position in the social order must be constantly performed, defended, and when possible, elevated. Letting an insult pass without response is not magnanimity, it's weakness. Failing to demonstrate your status is not modesty. It's an invitation for others to take advantage of you. The meal itself is lavish in a way that would be impossible to sustain daily, but is necessary for occasions like this. Multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last. Roasted meats of various kinds, pork, beef, mutton, goat, horse, possibly game birds if the hunting has been good. Fish prepared in various ways, both fresh and preserved. Bread of different types, some made from wheat, which is expensive and therefore prestigious. Butter, cheese, skyr, a kind of cultured dairy product that's both nutritious and storable. Preserved fruits and possibly even imported luxuries like honey from further south, spices from the distant trade networks that connect Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and beyond. And drink. The drinking at these feasts is not casual social imbibing. It's ritualized, competitive, and dangerous. Allah and mead flow in quantities that seem absurd until you remember that for much of history, fermented beverages were safer than water, and that demonstrating you could provide unlimited drink was a way of demonstrating wealth and generosity. The drinking horns passed around the hall are not small. Some hold a liter or more. Refusing to drink is not really an option. It would be taken as an insult to the host's hospitality. Drinking slowly or carefully is seen as suspicious, possibly cowardly. The culture expects you to drink deeply and frequently and to remain functional while doing so. This leads to a fascinating dynamic where everyone is simultaneously getting progressively more intoxicated while also trying to maintain their dignity and remain alert to the complex social dynamics playing out around them. Tempers shorten, grudges resurface, old insults are remembered and brought up. The line between friendly competition and actual hostility becomes blurry. And through it all, the host must manage the proceedings, preventing outright violence while also allowing enough edge, enough tension, to keep things interesting. The entertainment during the feast is itself a form of religious and political expression. Poets, skalds, stand and recite elaborate verses praising the Jarl, recounting his deeds in battle, tracing his lineage back to legendary ancestors, and possibly to the gods themselves. These are not simple poems. They're complex, alliterative compositions that follow strict metrical rules and make use of elaborate metaphors called kennings. A ship is a whale-rowed traveler. A warrior is a storm of swords. Blood is wound dew. Battle is the meeting of shields. The skald who can compose such poetry extemporaneously, fitting the formal requirements while also delivering effective praise or subtle criticism, is highly valued and well compensated. A good skald can enhance a jarl's reputation simply by composing verses about him that others will memorize and repeat. A poor skald, or worse, a skald who composes insulting verses, can damage a reputation in ways that outlast any individual battle or raid. This is why the Vikings took poetry so seriously. It was their form of mass media, their way of creating and preserving reputation, and reputation was more valuable than silver. Between the poetic recitations, there are stories, sagas about the settlement of Iceland or Norway, tales of legendary heroes like Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, myths about the gods, perhaps the story of how Odin won the mead of poetry by seducing the giantess who guarded it, transforming into an eagle to escape, and regurgitating the mead back into Asgard. This last detail, the god literally vomiting up the sacred drink of poetic inspiration, is told without embarrassment or reverence, because the Norse gods are not prudish or particularly dignified. They're powerful, yes, but they're also prone to foolishness, trickery, lust, and other very human failings. The stories serve multiple purposes. They entertain, obviously, helping to pass the long hours of the feast. They educate, teaching proper behavior through example and counterexample. They reinforce social bonds, creating shared cultural knowledge that marks you as part of the community. And they provide a framework for understanding reality, explaining why things are the way they are, from the cosmic level down to the social level. For instance, the story of the origin of social classes. According to the poem Ríkstula, the god Heimdall wandered the earth in disguise, visiting 3 households and fathering children with the women of each house. The children born from the poorest household became thralls, slaves. The children from the middle household became free farmers. The children from the wealthy household became jarls, nobles. This story literally encodes the social hierarchy as divinely ordained. The jarl listening to this story at his feast is not just a powerful man who happens to have more wealth than others. He is, according to the mythology, descended from gods, born to rule, his status part of the cosmic order. Whether anyone actually believed this literally is impossible to say. Probably belief existed on a spectrum, just as it does in any religion. But whether or not you believed it literally, the story provided a framework, a justification, a way of understanding and accepting social inequality. And, conveniently for the jarls, it was a framework that reinforced their power. As the feast progresses into the later hours, the religious elements and the social elements become increasingly difficult to separate. Toasts are drunk to the gods, but they're drunk in a specific order that also reflects social priorities. First to Odin for victory, then to Njordr and Freyr for peace and good seasons, then to Bragi, god of poetry, then perhaps to departed relatives, the honored dead whose memories are preserved and whose influence continues, and then to living allies, to the king, if there is one, to prominent men whose support and friendship are valuable. Each toast is an opportunity for speech-making, for reaffirming relationships, for subtle political maneuvering. The Jarl might toast a visitor and in doing so, obliquely reference a pending alliance or trade agreement. A warrior might toast his lord and, in the words chosen, remind everyone of his service and his expectation of future rewards. A rival might toast his competitor with words that seem friendly but carry an undertone of challenge. Everyone is performing, constantly, using the ritualized format of the feast to conduct business that could be risky or impossible to conduct otherwise. And, running through all of this, the eating, the drinking, the poetry, the stories, the toasts, is the fundamental Norse concept of vörd or örlog, the idea that fate is already woven but must still be enacted. The Jarl knows on some level that his power is temporary, that he will age, weaken, die, that younger men will rise to challenge his position, that everything he's built can be lost in a single unlucky battle or raid. And yet he continues to build, to display wealth, to form alliances, to perform his status, not because he believes he can escape fate, but because this is what one does. You play your role in the tapestry as well as you can, with as much courage and style as you can muster. There's something simultaneously tragic and admirable about this worldview. The Jarl is powerful. He commands men, controls wealth, lives in luxury compared to the ordinary farmers we discussed in the first segment. But he's also trapped in an endless cycle of performance and competition, constantly defending his status, constantly aware that any sign of weakness will be exploited, constantly preparing for battles and confrontations that might end in his death or the destruction of everything he's worked for. And his religion offers him no escape from this. The gods won't save him. They can't even save themselves. Odin gathers warriors in Valhalla not because he loves them or wants to reward them, but because he needs them for Ragnarok, the final battle that he knows he'll lose. Thor fights giants constantly, protecting the world, but everyone knows the giants will eventually win. Freya receives half the battle dead in her hall Folkvanger, but whether this is a reward or simply another obligation, another role to play in the cosmic drama, is unclear. The best you can hope for, as a warrior noble in this worldview, is to die gloriously, to be remembered, to have skalds compose poems about you that people will recite for generations, to become part of the story, part of the tradition, part of the cultural inheritance that outlasts your physical existence. It's not salvation, exactly. It's more like a kind of limited immortality. You live on in memory, in reputation, in the stories told about you at feasts like this one. As the night deepens and the drinking continues, the atmosphere in the hall changes. The earlier formality loosens. Conversations break up into smaller groups. Some men are boasting now, telling exaggerated stories of their own deeds or challenging others to contests of strength or skill. Some are making deals, marriages to be arranged, trading partnerships to be formed, land to be exchanged. Some are simply too drunk to do much beyond slur their words and try not to fall off their benches. And some are plotting, because feasts like this, while they're supposed to be occasions of peace and hospitality, are also ideal opportunities for conspiracy. Everyone important is gathered in one place. Conversations can be had away from witnesses. Alliances can be formed or broken. The Jarl must remain alert to this possibility, even as he appears relaxed and generous. His loyal men must watch for signs of treachery. Trust is always provisional in this world, always contingent on continued mutual benefit. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but illustrative, about a jarl who noticed that several of his guests kept glancing at each other meaningfully during a feast. He realized they were planning to attack him. But instead of confronting them directly, which would violate the sacred obligation of hospitality and potentially start a blood feud, he simply announced that the feast would continue for 3 more days. He kept them there, kept them drinking, kept them entertained, until the king he had secretly sent word to arrived with enough men to make any attack suicidal. The plotters left peacefully, their plans thwarted, and the jarl's reputation for cleverness was enhanced. Whether or not this particular story is true, it illustrates the complex game being played at these feasts. Honor requires you to protect your guests, but honor also requires you to protect yourself and your family. Hospitality is sacred, but betrayal is always possible. The gods value courage, but also cunning. Odin himself is the god of wisdom and war, but also of deception and manipulation. He's the god who hung on a tree for knowledge, but he's also the god who seduced Gunlod to steal the mead of poetry and then abandoned her. Norse ethics are not simple or consistent. They're situational, complex, full of contradictions that each person must navigate as best they can. Finally, deep in the night, the feast begins to wind down. Some guests have already departed or been given places to sleep in the hall or outbuildings. Others remain, the hardiest drinkers and the most politically important, those with whom the jarl wants to speak privately, now that the formal, public portion of the feast is over. These conversations might be where the real business of the evening gets conducted, agreements confirmed, grievances aired, intelligence shared. The jarl's wife has long since retired, her duties as hostess complete, though she's likely still awake, processing the evening's events, considering how various interactions might affect the family's position, planning future moves in the endless chess game of aristocratic politics. Her perspective is different from her husband's, but no less strategic. She's thinking about marriages for children, about alliances that can be built through fostering relationships, about which families are rising and which are declining, about how to position her household for advantage over the coming years. As dawn approaches, or what passes for dawn in the endless twilight of a northern summer night, the last guests finally sleep or depart. The hall is a wreck. Food scraps everywhere, spilled drink, the fire burning down to embers. Thralls are already beginning the enormous task of cleaning up, a task that will take hours. The jarl himself finally sleeps, perhaps still slightly drunk, certainly exhausted from the social performance he's been maintaining all evening. And in his sleep, perhaps he dreams. Perhaps he dreams of Valhalla, Odin's hall, where the Einherjar, the chosen warriors, feast every night on the meat of a boar that's reborn each day and drink mead served by Valkyries. This is supposed to be a reward, the best possible afterlife for a warrior. And yet, if you think about it for more than a moment, it's a rather grim reward. You spend your days fighting, killed in battle each day, resurrected each evening to feast. Forever. Until Ragnarok comes and you march out to die permanently in a battle you know you'll lose. Is this really a reward? Or is it just another obligation, another role to play in the cosmic drama? The Jarl might wonder this in his dreams, or he might not. It's possible that the grimness of the afterlife simply doesn't bother him the way it might bother us. He's been raised in a culture that accepts doom as inevitable, that values courage in the face of hopeless odds, that finds honor in the struggle rather than the outcome. Valhalla is not heaven, it's not eternal peace and joy, but it's a hall full of worthy companions, endless fighting and feasting, and the honor of dying alongside the gods themselves when the end finally comes. For a warrior noble, that might be enough. But we're getting philosophical again, which is a sign that we've been at this feast too long. Let us step outside the Jarl's hall, into the cold night air, and consider what we've observed. We've seen religion and politics utterly intertwined, impossible to separate. We've seen wealth and power displayed through hospitality and generosity. We've seen a social elite that must constantly perform its status, defend its honor, navigate complex webs of obligation and rivalry. We've seen a worldview that acknowledges inevitable doom, but insists on facing it with courage and style. And we've seen how different this elite experience is from the daily life of the ordinary farmer we inhabited in the first segment. The farmer makes offerings at a small shrine, works constantly just to survive, lives with uncertainty and fear. The Jarl makes sacrifices of valuable animals, lives in relative luxury, commands men and resources. But both are bound by the same fundamental Norse outlook. Fate is inexorable. The gods are powerful but not saving. Death comes for everyone, and the best you can do is face it all with dignity. The Jarl has more wealth, more power, more comfort. But he also has more to lose, more enemies, more complex obligations. His feast is more elaborate than the farmer's simple meal, but it's also more dangerous, full of potential for violence and betrayal. His connection to the gods is more formal, more public, more laden with political significance. But it's not necessarily more sincere or more effective. The gods are no more likely to save a jarl than a farmer. They're too busy with their own problems, their own doom. And so the wheel of Norse life turns, from the fields to the feast halls, from the simple offerings to the great sacrifices, from the anonymous farmer to the renowned jarl. All of it temporary, all of it fated to end. All of it worth doing anyway, because what else would one do? Surrender to despair? Refuse to participate in the cosmic drama? That would be worse than pointless. It would be dishonorable. Better to feast while you can. Tell stories, make offerings, form alliances, fight when necessary, die when you must, and hope that someone remembers you well enough to tell stories about you at future feasts, keeping you alive in memory if not in body, giving you that limited immortality that's the best the Norse worldview can offer. It's not much, perhaps, but it's something. And in a cosmos heading inevitably toward Ragnarok, in a world where even the gods will die, something is quite a lot, actually. The feast is over. The guests have departed. The fire burns low, and the long northern night continues, as it always has, as it always will, until the final darkness comes and swallows everything. But that's a problem for another day. For now, there's sleep. Deep, dreamless sleep, if you're fortunate. Or sleep filled with dreams of ravens and wolves and the distant sound of horns announcing battles yet to come. Either way, sleep. Because tomorrow will bring more work, more offerings, more careful navigation of obligations and relationships, more life lived in the shadow of doom. But that, as we've said, is for tomorrow. Tonight, finally, we rest.